Hey there, this is Seid, founder of Cascadia Workshops, and this video is on integral theory, and we're going to cover lines of development. This is video number 2. The first video was on quadrants, the four quadrants, and I also covered the concept of holons before introducing quadrants. And this is with me, Seid. What do I mean by coach and mentor to positive change agents? I work with people who have a dual commitment. They're committed to leaving the world a better place than they found it, and they're committed to their own personal growth and development. So that dual commitment is what sets my clients apart, and that's who I love to work with to help them reach their goals, their dreams, their aspirations, and to make their visions a reality. Little inspiration here. Everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Albert Einstein. Let's review the four quadrants real quick. Here we have this image that shows us that everything in the world has an individual expression and a collective expression, and it also has an interior and an exterior. And so the individual interior is I, the upper left. The individual exterior is it, the upper right. And the collective interior is we versus the collective it's of our shared exterior reality. So the upper left, I, quadrant is level of intentions, experiential, intrapersonal, and subjective. Whereas the individual exterior we can think of as physiological, behavioral, and objective. In the lower left, the collective interior, the we space, is interpersonal, intersubjective, and cultural. And the it's, the shared exterior it's, is where we find systems. You can think of it as the interobjective realm, and social as opposed to cultural. So what empirical science can tell us about are the things that can be weighed and measured, meaning it can only tell us about the right-hand quadrants. The left-hand quadrants have depth and therefore must be interpreted. One other thing to keep in mind is none of these four quadrants can be reduced to any of the other quadrants. All four of them tetra evolve, and they tetra influence each other. So they're always influencing each other and morphing with each other, but they cannot be reduced to each other. So before we get into lines of development, I want to introduce two major concepts. The first one is known as the three strands of valid knowledge accumulation, which is also known as the three strands of quote-unquote deep science. The next major concept that I want to cover before we get into lines of development is known as the pre-trans fallacy, also known as the pre-post confusion. Having these concepts down will help us as we move forward and we start to put together not just quadrants and lines, but also the next video is on stages and states, and after that we'll look at types. And that'll put together the minimum components of the integral framework. So the three strands of valid knowledge accumulation, also known as the three strands of deep science, why is this important? It's important because especially as we get into things in the left-hand quadrants, for example, things like meditation, things that empirical science has a hard time proving because its elements cannot be weighed and measured in the same way that you can say in physics, weigh and measure a snowflake, for example, or a rock. People who tend to be reductionistic toward the right-hand quadrants tend to dismiss interior experiences and practices such as meditation. And so I want to bring this piece in so that we can start to include all of it and have a more holistic view of the world and how it works. So the three strands of valid knowledge accumulation. The first is an injunction. I think of it as a proposition or a challenge. For example, science does not say, just observe. Science says if you want to know X, then do Y. If you want to know whether a cell has a nucleus, then learn how a microscope works and learn how to stain the slides and look through it. So science says, if you want to know something, then do something. Then there's technically what's known as apprehension, which is your personal perception or experience. And the third is confirmation or refutation by a community of similarly developed individuals, or a community of the adequate, as it's known in some circles. A community of sufficiently and similarly developed individuals, quote unquote, the experts, or simply people sufficiently qualified in a given field. So it's similar with, I brought up earlier, meditation. So if you want to learn to meditate, do this thing. Then you check your personal experience. Then you can check with your teacher or other experienced meditators to say, am I doing it right? Is this what I'm supposed to be experiencing? And they'll give you pointers or they'll laugh. But somebody who knows nothing about meditation isn't qualified to offer their opinion there. So when we get into something like, for example, theoretical math, no one has ever seen out in the world the square root of -2 running around. It's just not out there. So theoretical math, for example, is one of these things that we can't prove through things being weighed or measured, but we still have these three strands. They still apply. So if you do these proofs, these math problems, now check your experience, and now check with people who have been working in this field for a while. If you want to check your work on theoretical math, I'm the wrong person. That's just not my field. I have zero expertise there. So if you look at all knowledge accumulation, it contains these three strands, whether we're talking about the objective world or whether we're talking about phenomenology, the intrapersonal space, or whether we're talking about the we space and tools, for example, like NVC, nonviolent communication. These three strands still apply there. So I wanted to mention this one important concept. And the next one is the pre-post confusion, also known as the pre-trans fallacy. So from the AQUAL glossary, and AQUAL, AQAL, stands for all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types. So it's a shorthand for the integral framework, AQAL. And there's a great piece of work called the AQUAL glossary. And here's what it says about the pre-post confusion. In any recognized developmental sequence, the confusion of a pre-X stage and a trans-X stage simply because both are non-X. This fallacy has two major forms: the reduction of trans-X to pre-X and the elevation of pre-X to trans-X. I know this is dense, I'll explain it in a second. For example, the confusion of pre-rational and trans-rational, or pre-personal and transpersonal, or pre-conventional and post-conventional. So just using that example, during the WTO protests, the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999, you had protesters who could give you a clear rationale for why the World Trade Organization was not an adequate instrument to represent most interests and needs. They could point out, this is a panel of mostly corporate lawyers, and every case of corporations versus sea turtles, corporations versus small farmers, corporations versus the environment, the corporations have always won out. That would be a post-conventional argument against the World Trade Organization. The pre-conventional argument was, down with the system! Down with the man! You can't tell me what to do! And because they're both non-conventional, they're both lumped together. So the media coverage of protests, which predictably focused on people breaking windows and things like that, fed into this confusion of pre-conventional protesters and post-conventional protesters. So the pre-post confusion happens when we create some false dichotomies that don't take into account growth and development. I just gave you the example of conventional versus non-conventional. There's not, it's pre-conventional and post-conventional get lumped together as non-conventional. Also rational versus non-rational. So a 6-month-old, 7-month-old who doesn't reason things out, we tend to elevate that into some highly spiritual state. And there are elements of that in the sense of how present babies are and how open they are, but it doesn't mean we need to elevate a pre-rational state to some post or trans-rational glory. What's happening is a developmental process, pre-conventional to conventional to post-conventional, or pre-rational to rational to trans-rational. So I just want to keep the 3 strands of valid knowledge accumulation and the pre-post confusion as important concepts as we move through the integral theory. So let's talk about lines of development. These are similar to multiple intelligences as pioneered by Howard Gardner, although this would imply that they're only in the upper left quadrant, but you do have lines of development in the other quadrants. But this is a simple way of thinking about it. Basically, I'm better at some things than I am at others. Multiple intelligence, as I was saying, describes events in the upper left quadrant only, whereas the concept of lines of development can describe phenomena in all 4 quadrants. For the purpose of our discussion, I'll focus primarily on upper left quadrant descriptions. And officially recognized lines of development or streams or intelligence are based on research. So I can use the term informally. For example, I could talk about basketball intelligence. You know, I can improve in basketball. I get better at basketball. And I don't suddenly forget the thing that I learned. Once it's integrated in my being, I don't necessarily regress. Yes, I can get rusty, but there's a developmental progression where I can get better at basketball. Or we can think about it as tree planting intelligence. You can get better at planting trees. But that would be an informal use. And to use it formally, we need to talk about lines that are recognized and validated through research. So let's look at some major lines of development. Howard Gardner recognizes 9 or 10. Ken Wilber says he recognizes over 24 lines of development. Among them is our cognitive development. One of the major researchers there is Piaget. We can look at moral or ethical development. We can look at kinesthetic lines of development or the kinesthetic intelligence, emotional intelligence, musical intelligence, logical, mathematical intelligence, which is what schools mostly focus on. And they don't realize that we're all better at some things than others, and some kids really thrive in musical intelligence or kinesthetic intelligence. We have others, psychosexual, interpersonal, needs and values, and there are many more. Like I said, Ken recognizes over 2,000. I recommend looking at the charts in the back of the book Integral Psychology for a much more robust kind of handling of this and how they all correlate. Essentially, development is uneven, right? Like, how many degrees between water freezing and water boiling? Well, it just depends which system you're using. If you're using Celsius, there's 100 degrees. If you're using Fahrenheit, it's 212 minus 32, so 180. So again, how we break up the developmental space is different in different systems, just like Celsius and Fahrenheit break up the temperature space differently. Not all lines are ontologically equivalent. What I mean by that is that some lines depend on others. For example, the cognitive line seems to lead or precede the growth of other lines, like, for example, moral development. You don't find people who are highly ethically or morally evolved, like Bishop Desmond Tutu or Nelson Mandela or saints and sages throughout the ages, without also having a really high cognitive line. You just don't see it. So, for example, here we have person 1 and person 2. Person 1 is in the darker lines. Person 2 is a little lighter color. And there you have, cognitive, moral, musical, psychosexual, spiritual. This is just to show that development doesn't happen linearly. So on the cognitive line, we have pre-rational, rational, trans-rational. On the moral line, we have pre-conventional or egocentric, and then conventional, ethnocentric. So egocentric meaning only I matter, ethnocentric, only other people who look like me matter, sociocentric, only people from my nationality matter or from my culture, and post-conventional or world-centric, really how far does my compassionate embrace extend to? Who matters? Who do we consider we or us? So like that, how you break up this developmental space is different. Now let's take these people 1 and 2 and let's look at it a little differently. Here we have person 1 and person 2 with the various lines. Now let's say you run into person 2, super high cognitive, super high musical intelligence, and let's say they have very high spiritual intelligence, which right now I'll define as very high ability to enter meditative states of deep presence. But that person happens to be very low on the moral line and the psychosexual line. Does this remind you of anyone? Bing! Think of how many spiritual teachers have gotten in trouble by getting sexually involved with their students. So again, development is uneven, and people develop unevenly, and we assume that just because somebody's amazing at one thing, that they're amazing at everything, and that's so often not true. So development is uneven, and also the map is not the territory. Really important. We're talking about these concepts. We're building a conceptual map with holons, quadrants, lines, levels, states, types. But again, the map is not the territory, and development is not linear. So what is the goal when it comes to human development? What is the goal? We need to be clear about this distinction between being integrally informed versus integrally developed. The goal is not to become a 10 out of 10 on every line of development, to be like this superhuman personal development decathlon Olympic gold medalist. That's not the goal. We want to at least be integrally informed. We want to be aware of all this stuff, because as you get higher in your development, you enter what we call second tier, which I'll define in a little bit. The prime directive becomes the health of the entire spiral of development, not just my worldview is the only correct one. And specialization is fine. You can specialize in whatever area, but if you're integrally informed, then at least you see this larger context, and you can bring quadrants, lines, levels, states, types. You can bring integral theory to bear on your area of specialization. So specialization is great, just be integrally informed. And nobody's expecting you to be integrally developed. Although, if that floats your boat, go for it. So here's, for example, the values line. And this is based on the work of Claire Graves as expanded on by Don Beck and Chris Cohen. And here you see some of the different levels. And we have egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric. And in spiral dynamics, these are color-coded. I'm not going to go deeply into this because you can look up spiral dynamics on your own. But that's just the values line of development. Now let's put that next to some other ones. There's Abraham Maslow on needs, Jean Gebser in terms of worldviews, Claire Graves or spiral dynamics in terms of values. And here we have on the right hand side, you can see how it's divided into first tier, second tier, third tier. And on the very left, using the color spectrum simply as a sort of a shared ruler or a shared yardstick. So here we're comparing 3 lines of development and the different levels on those lines. So let's add some more here. On the left you have the cognitive line, and you can see the integration there of work from Piaget and also Sri Aurobindo. Here we're adding a few other lines of development. But again, when you look at the charts, for example, at the back of Integral Psychology, what you'll notice is that all these different researchers, all these different systems, they don't agree on the specific terminology, they don't agree on the details, but they all agree that there's a general developmental space. So how does this apply in the real world? Let's look at a social change case study. And I'm using a fancy term that I did not come up with. I first heard it from Ken, integral multilingualism. So just to give you a little background, in his book, The Cultural Creatives, which was co-authored with Sherry Ruth Anderson, Paul Ray posits the following. He proposes that before World War II, there were two major subcultures in the United States. He calls them traditionals and moderns. And after World War II, a third major subculture showed up in significant numbers. He calls them cultural creatives, which we also know as postmoderns. The traditional value structure is ethnocentric or sociocentric, tends to be conformist, concerned with stability, safety, security, land rights, gun rights, what are generally identified as conservative values. In the United States, the Republican Party would see itself here. In spiral dynamics, this is the blue meme. And then you get into modern value structures. And remember that these are not rigid boxes. They tend to flow and don't have strict delineating lines. So just keep this in mind as we go through this. This is just a way of describing something that's been identified in the world. And I'm just setting the foundation here to talk about this social change case study. So in his book, Cultural Creatives, Paul Ray referred to these two value structures, traditionals and moderns, that were the major subcultures in the United States before World War II. The modern value structure is early world-centric. It's not until industrial societies that you actually see a universal declaration of human rights. That never existed before. So it's early world-centric, it's very individualistic, and it's associated with scientific rationality and the paradigm of economic growth. On the individual level, there's very much of an achievement orientation. Modern values. So in spiral dynamics, this would be the orange meme. The postmodern, or what Paul Ray calls cultural creatives, this value structure is more mature world-centric. It's egalitarian, sensitive toward others. These are the people that brought us a civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement. Postmodern values, or in spiral dynamics, it would be the green meme. So keep in mind these three different worldviews, traditionals, moderns, and postmoderns. So David Johnston, whom I have met, and I'm a big fan of his work, basing part of what he was doing on Paul Ray's work, he was able to get green building to become code. In other words, the law of the land in San Francisco County and Alameda County, which includes Oakland, Berkeley, and 12 other cities. He accomplished this by creating three distinct marketing strategies, one for traditionals, one for moderns, and one for postmoderns, recognizing the following. If you exclusively speak the language of one group, you turn off the other two. Many people trying to create positive social change have failed at reaching people where they are, reaching people where they're at, and have instead expected others to change their value structure to more closely match their own. So I'm preaching to other people about the environment, and I insist that they see the world my way. It doesn't work. That's been the Achilles heel of the environmental movement for 50 years. So for traditionals, David Johnston emphasized health and safety. For example, most fiberglass insulation is soaked in formaldehyde. You don't want your children near that, do you? For moderns, he emphasized the cost savings. Your monthly maintenance and heating bills will be lower. And only when he knew the group was all or mostly comprised of people with quote-unquote green values did he emphasize the positive environmental effects, positive environmental benefits. Green building reduces your carbon footprint and your overall impact on old growth forests. So this is an example of this work applied. When we look at different lines of development in subcultures, how do we speak the language to reach people where they're at? This is really important in social change. So we've covered lines of development. I hope that this made sense. They're similar to multiple intelligences. If you look, for example, in the lower left quadrant, you want to look at the we or the cultural space. There are some cultures that have evolved more functional restorative justice systems, for example, and other cultures that have evolved more enlightened transportation systems and like that. So different cultures are also better at some things than others. So that's an example of how we can look at that. If you want some cool free stuff, I recommend the top link, cascadiaworkshops.com/get connected. If you want to see what my previous clients have said about me, check out the second link, /testimonials, cascadiaworkshops.com testimonials. And if you're interested in 1 hour for free with me to explore whether or not we'd be a good match for working together in a coach and mentor and client relationship, please get in touch, and you can sign up for that there at cascadiaworkshops.com/session. I hope you enjoyed this, and I am wishing you the best. Bye.